Hey, it's great to virtually see you today. Really happy to have you join us here at New Day Church, Brandon, Florida. We're in a series called FACETIME, where we're looking at 5 different stories of face-to-face encounters Jesus had with individuals. And today we're going to be looking at a story in John chapter 13. If you follow along in the Bible with me, go ahead and open your Bible there right now. By the way, I want to thank the pastors of Traders Point Church in Indianapolis for their sermon series, where I'm getting much of my inspiration and content for this series. Great church up there. Thank you all. All right, today I want to begin with this question. Have you ever had a room full of kids having a sleepover, and they're outside running and playing like crazy all afternoon, all evening, and they come inside, take off their shoes, and fall into the bed? Let me ask you this question. Is it like fresh as a daisy when you open that bedroom door in the morning? Probably not, right? We've all been there if we've had kids. I had a happy birthday wish on my Facebook page last week from a girl who was in our youth group at a church several years ago. Sweetest little girl you can imagine. But one of my most vivid memories of her was on an out-of-state bus trip when we were pretty sure someone had rotten hard-boiled eggs in their luggage. We even started investigating. Have you ever smelled rotten eggs? It turned out it was her socks. Worst smell ever. Parents know what I mean, don't you? All right, today I want to take you to a room that was filled with 24 very stinky feet attached to 12 very confused men. We know them as the disciples, and the room was the last place they would ever congregate all together with Jesus. Now, you're probably familiar with the scene and heard about it and read about it a number of times. These disciples are gathered to celebrate the Passover. That was the celebration of deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt hundreds of years before. And they would have been in a very festive mood, probably joking, laughing. I mean, it is a celebration. And they're probably telling stories like guys will do, trying to outdo each other, you know. In fact, Luke, writing about this same story, tells us that 2 of them were arguing with each other about who was the greatest among the disciples. So there was a lot of testosterone flowing in the room that day when they were gathered. And of course, Jesus is there taking it all in, maybe laughing at some of the stories, but laughing with sort of an underlying somberness. Sort of like when you're trying to be enthusiastic as you read a bedtime story to your small child, but it's difficult because your heart is full of all the, how will I ever pay that bill? How will we ever make it through this crisis sort of a thing? Have you been there? Which is probably why Jesus did something in that moment that these men would remember for the rest of their lives. Watch this in verse 1 of chapter 13. John says, just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that the time had come to leave the world to go to the Father. Having loved His dear companions, He continued to love them right to the end. It was supper time. The devil by now had Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, firmly in his grip, all set for the betrayal. Jesus knew that the Father had put Him in complete charge of everything, that He came from God, and that He was on His way back to God. Now, right off, John makes it clear that Jesus was fully aware of 3 things. Number 1, that He had power over everything. Number 2, that He was fully God. And number 3, that He was soon to leave the earth and return to the Father. Now watch this. Knowing what He knows about Himself, knowing who He fully is, what does He do? If you knew you were some superhero, not Batman, of course, because I'm Batman, right? So not Batman, but if you knew you were a superhero and you were in this room and you knew about yourself what Jesus knew about Himself, what would you do? How would you respond? With some miracle perhaps? Maybe zap old Judas and change his heart right there on the scene? Or let these men know in no uncertain terms that you are the man, you are the woman? But look what Jesus did in verse 4. He got up from His supper table, set aside His robe, and put on an apron. Then He poured a basin of water and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with His apron. And suffice it to say, this completely threw these disciples for a loop. So watch what happens. Two things this morning. Number one, life is about a towel, not a robe. When Jesus was confronted with a woman caught in the act of adultery, you might remember what he did. He got down in the dirt with her on her level, eye to eye, equal to her, to speak to her. Here in this story, we see him take a basin and a towel and once again kneel down, this time in front of his disciples. And there's a good lesson for us there. And here it is. Love stoops. God stoops down. Think about that. Jesus, the Son of God, on his knees in the dirt and the filth, the maker and creator of all that is, the one who simply spoke and all things came into being, stooping down to wash dirty feet. How many of you know those disciples just had their minds blown? And I'm sure they were amazed, but they were also really confused. I mean, what's he doing? I'm not getting this. Does anyone understand? Now listen, they had seen Jesus do quite a few radical things over the course of their 3 years together. But this was entirely different. This time it directly involved them and their personal vulnerability. Now, by the way, the practice of foot washing was quite common in ancient civilizations, primarily because the people mostly wore sandals, and they pretty much walked everywhere they went, right? Well, along with that, the roads that they traveled were dusty, the fields where they crossed were often muddy, and there was no city dump, so trash would oftentimes be out in the street. And also they would walk along the same paths that the donkeys and camels would walk, so they would step in the droppings of these animals. So you put that all together and it means that people's feet would have been hard and calloused and covered in mud and camel dung. I mean, we are talking rotten egg nasty, right? That's why the washing of feet was the first thing that happened when one entered a home. And usually that foot washing was done by a servant or someone of lesser status than the one that was being washed. Now, Luke tells us about this story that they were in a borrowed room. That would mean there would be no servant available for them. So these men didn't really know what to do. And no one takes the initiative to wash anyone's feet or even their own feet. So what happens? Well, Jesus himself pushes back from the table and removes his robe and picks up a towel. And so again, these disciples were shocked, to say the least. Listen, have you ever wondered what God looks like? Here's a picture of God. God on earth is a servant. That's why when F.F. Bruce wrote about this moment, he said this: the form of God was not exchanged for the form of a servant. It was revealed in the form of a servant. Isn't that good? In other words, it's not that Jesus acts like a servant right here. It is that Jesus in his essence is a servant. In fact, one time in Mark chapter 10, two of Jesus' disciples, James and John, came to him with a question. They said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." In other words, hey, we want you to do us a favor. Will you do us a favor? Jesus responded, "What do you want me to do for you?" They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." In other words, in heaven one day. Jesus, here's what they were saying: "Jesus, can we be the captain and the co-captain of your team? Can we be important? Can we be great? Will you put us here on the front of the line as the greatest?" And Jesus responds in a way to teach and correct their thinking in verse 45 when he says, "I have not come to be served, but to serve and give my life a ransom for many." Now let me illustrate that for you. Have you ever had a day at the spa? Men? Never mind. Ladies? Anyway, you go in and the lights are low and everyone speaks in hushed tones like we don't want to upset the karma or whatever, right? And there's this soft music in the background and you drink lots of water with cucumbers in it. And the best thing is this: they give you a robe. Not a t-shirt, no pants on the ground, looking like a fool with your pants on the ground. None of that kind of stuff, right? When you go in there, they give you the robe, and the robe is like symbolic. It's always a lush robe. And it's symbolic that today, this moment is all about you. Your comforts, your wants, your desires. No one else matters at this moment but you. Makes you feel special, doesn't it? Now listen, the message of the world today is the message of the robe. It could be all about you. It should be all about you, right? In fact, look at the advertising industry, even during this pandemic. No matter what they're selling, face mask, glove, toilet paper, what's the draw? What's the carrot? It is you. In other words, it's all about you, right? But then Jesus comes along and says, guys, listen, here's life. Here's true godliness. It's the towel. It's about serving. It is not about being served. Like many of you, I've been watching POTUS and his team's daily briefings. And then after the briefings, I hear and watch a little bit of the discussion on the various news channels. Maybe you do that too. I wondered the other day, what could our country and world be like if those men and women, those in Washington and those who bring the nightly news, if they could set an example for the rest of us by stopping all the rhetoric and the uncivil discourse and just pick up a towel? What if they, in a sense, washed each other's feet? And I mean across political divides. I'm talking about across the aisle, right? And I know that's a pipe dream. I get that. But wow, what if? Which brings me to the second thing this morning. And that is serving includes all, not just some. In verse 6, John says this. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. And then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but all of me, my hands and my feet as well. Jesus answered in verse 10, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. All right, now, let me say a couple of things here. Sometimes it's easier to give to someone than it is to receive from them, isn't it? Could part of serving actually be receiving? By that I mean when someone wants to do something nice or helpful for me and I let them, aren't I allowing them to use their God-given gifts to honor God through their service? Absolutely. Hey, when God is trying to encourage you and minister to you or even build you up through other people, learn how to receive that. Receive it graciously and with all humility. Let Jesus wash and serve you through others, because how many of you know that that's always a good thing? Look at verse 5. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. All right, now think about these 12 men around this table. First of all, you have people like Matthew. He was a disciple and would have been around the table. Matthew, the former tax collector. Imagine how he must have felt. I mean, everyone hated tax collectors, yes? But don't you know that when Matthew looked into his Savior's eyes, he just knew that he was okay, that all was well with his soul? Or how about John? John, that emotional disciple, that he even identifies himself as the one that Jesus loved. He was always so close to Jesus. I bet John was wrecked when this was going on. I mean, a mess. And I wonder if John might have if Jesus might have just kept consoling John. John, you just need to know I love you. It's okay, John. I love you, John. That's all that matters. Something like that. And then, of course, there's Judas. And this one is really crazy town, isn't it? Because Judas, at this point, had already betrayed or agreed to betray Jesus. At this point when this was taking place. Yet Jesus showed him nothing but grace. What in the world was going on in his mind as Jesus was washing his feet? Think about that one. Did he look in Jesus' eyes as Jesus was washing his feet? Could he look in Jesus' eyes? And what about Jesus himself? Think about this. At the time he washed Judas's bare feet, he knew those same feet would soon walk out of that room and betray him. Yet, he washed them anyway. Wow. If ever there was a picture of grace, I'm telling you, right there it is. Now, let me switch gears here with you for just a moment. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about your own service to other people, because we're to be Christ-like in our walk, and Christ was a servant. So think about our Christ-like service to others. And I want you to be honest. Are there people you have trouble serving? Like people who've hurt you, for instance, or betrayed you, or that one who always takes advantage of you, who never appreciates anything you do for them. You know a person like that, right? It's really difficult serving people like that. But then we read that Jesus washes the feet of Judas. How does that grab you? Listen, husbands or wives, how are you supposed to wash the feet of a spouse who's self-absorbed? It's all about him, or it's all about her. How do you deal with that? How do we as spouses deal with that kind of thing? Or parents, how do you wash the feet of your teenagers? Now there's a bunch of Judases for you, am I right? Teenagers. I mean, they're going to do the opposite of what you tell them to do. And while they're doing the opposite of what you tell them to do, they're going to roll their eyes at you. They're going to treat you like a personal ATM machine, and then they're just going to shrug their shoulders and use whatever, every other word that comes out of their mouth. So anyway, how do we do it? How do we wash the feet of those who disrespect us from time to time or treat us badly, maybe hurt or betray us? Well, we do it just like Jesus did, through the power and strength of the God in you. That's why the Apostle Paul would later say, I can do all things that God has for me. I can do all things because of Christ, the Christ who lives in me. In John chapter 13, verse 12, it says this, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. And I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So how do you make application from this story? How can we be blessed like Jesus is talking about? I mean, are we literally to wash the feet of people that we encounter? You see that? Hey, you're in Publix. Hey, come here just for a minute. Walk over here in the greeting card aisle. I just want to wash your feet. That's not going to happen, right? But we can find ways to serve those people. Watch this. Let me give you two areas. With your family, for instance. Start with your spouse, or your kids, or your parents, or if you're single, that person or two closest to you. Now here's the thing. Pre-virus, most families had an incredibly insane schedule. Am I right? Guess what? It will be that way after this virus too, so just get ready. You will once again be running around like a chicken with your head cut off. Your stress meter will max out once again. I can promise you that. Speaking of stress, by the way, stress is also an issue during the pandemic, isn't it? Maybe has even been exacerbated since the pandemic came along. In fact, how many of you would like me to take a video of your day at home and then let me play it again next Sunday right before my sermon? Some would, but a great many of us, and I said us, would not want that to happen. And here's why. Because stress has caused tempers to flare more easily and caused patience to all but disappear in some of our relationships. You've heard the phrase, you're getting on my last nerve, right? Some of you don't even have a last nerve anymore, do you? So here's the question for you. What would it do to the stress levels in your relationships if you decided to stop pointing fingers of blame and stop yelling and just start washing feet? In other words, if you start looking for opportunities to meet the other's needs first. If you start serving one another instead of demanding that the other person or persons serves you. And I know this is tough, not easy. A lot easier said than done. Believe me, I get that. But it can happen if we really want it to happen. Again, with the God in us. All right, so also think of this. Also with others. Not just with family, but with others. Take work or school, for instance. For some of you, that's a tough environment. I mean, you got the Antichrist working or sitting right next to you, right? You know that one. Listen, think with me for a moment. What if God has placed you there in that position for this season of your life to wash some feet? What if you're there to serve? Now listen, this is huge. I remind our church often, they have a ministry outside our church that I will never have. And I have a ministry outside our church that they will never have. At work, in our homes, and where we go about our day-to-day. Every other place life takes us, because we have different circles of friends and acquaintances. I have this friend I see often, and he's a train wreck. I mean, he really is. He has some messy areas. Do you know someone with some messy areas? Well, anyway, he knows I'm a pastor, obviously, and we've been friends for a number of years now. And he's also been around church folk long enough to know what we all are supposed to think of people like him. But do you know what? For all these years I've known him, I have never brought up his mess, not once. Now, he has broached the subject more than a few times, which has led us to some things, to talk through some things pretty seriously, good talks. But my point is, not once have I busted his chops or called out his sin. What I have done, however, is wash his feet by simply just loving him for who he is, right where he is, as God's beloved, made in God's image. And he's responded to that. He brings up the subject of his life. He brings up the places where he's struggling. He brings up the questions of, what do I do now? How can I control this sort of a thing? Now, some more religious folk, if they hear me say things like I just did, they would tell me I'm doing a disservice to that man, that I should be calling out his sin and calling out his messiness. And I'm not saying that some things don't need to be called out. They do. There are some things that at times need to be addressed. Hatred, racism, bigotry, prejudice, all those things and more must be called out. I'm not denying that. But what if calling those things out are not nearly as much about saying shame on you as they are about washing feet? Now let me have that sink in just for a moment. In other words, what if we genuinely love and serve and meet each other's needs first? What if we do the stooping and bending down first? Wouldn't that be God-honoring? And wouldn't that have the potential to be the catalyst that maybe turns another person's life around? I think so. What if Democrats and Republicans washed each other's feet? Think about that one. What if straight and LGBTQ washed each other's feet? What if black and white and brown washed each other's feet? And I'll be honest, I don't know to what degree any of that can actually happen, but couldn't we try? Because the same Jesus who served these disciples by washing their feet is the same Jesus who lives in each one of us, right? That's what the Bible teaches us. That's what we preach. He's the same Jesus in us, so yes, we can try. And yes, at least to some degree, we can succeed. You remember from last week the phrase, more of Jesus, less of me, putting others first. We talked about all that last week. More of Jesus, less of me. Let me challenge you with this week. Let's keep practicing that more of Jesus and less of me. And let's keep practicing it by asking God to present opportunities for us this week to serve someone rather than looking for ways that we can be served. It's easy when everything's against you, when we're up under it like we are during this pandemic time with all the economy and everything that goes along with it, it's real easy to want someone to serve me, to minister to me, to build me up, to encourage me. But you know what? The Bible says, what I give, I shall receive. So wouldn't it be a good thing if I served others first, and then before I ever tried to get someone to serve me? And guess what? If we do that, God will intervene and He will do it. I promise you He will. And not only will the person you serve be blessed, guess what? You will be blessed. Again, what you give, you're going to receive. So that's it for today. We'll be back here next week. Let me say this. Let me hear from you this week, all right? Share your serving story with me. Share your foot washing story with me. Send me a message on our website or an email or on social media. And also along with that, let me know your prayer requests, okay? And I look forward to seeing you next week as we conclude this series. I'm going to conclude it with a message called Out on a Limb. It'll be something you don't want to miss, all right? So have a blessed rest of your day. Have a blessed week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.